Good morning, everyone. We'll get started in just a minute. I see there's still a few more folks logging in, so we'll give them another minute or so. Thanks. Hi, John Diamond. I wonder if you could mute your video for us.
I was muted. It's not me you're hearing.
No, Okay, that's a couple minutes past the top of the hour, so we'll get started. Good day, everyone. On behalf of the Chartered Institute of Logistics and Transport in North America, here and after CILTNA, welcome to today's webinar. As you know, our speaker today is Rachael Radford of Mira Consulting, who will address opportunities and challenges with technology, strategy, and adoption. More on Rachael and on Mira in a moment. But first, a very brief word from your hosts. The Chartered Institute of Logistics and Transport is a professional body of over 34,000 members working in over 30 countries. CILTNA, of course, is the North American branch. Our aim is to develop the science and art of transport and logistics through education, research, networking, and information sharing. If you're interested in learning more about the benefits of becoming a professional member of our institute, please see CILTNA.com. This is one of a series of webinars being hosted by CILTNA on matters of interest to the transportation and logistics communities, in line with our educational mandate. We're honored by your attendance today, and we hope to see you at future CILTNA webinars as well. My name is Paul Miller, and I'll be the moderator for today's session. We are delighted to have BCIT School of Business and Media as the sponsor of today's webinar. In addition, we'd also like to acknowledge the generous and ongoing support through national sponsorships provided to CILTNA by the Greater Toronto Airports Authority and Canadian Pacific Railway. We greatly appreciate the community mindedness of all of our sponsors. Now, as I mentioned, we are indeed fortunate to have as our speaker Ms. Rachael Radford, who is the founder and co-owner of Mira Consulting, Inc. Mira exists to help businesses get the most out of their processes, technology, and people so they can reach their strategic goals. Mira supports organizations in strategic design and execution, process optimization, and technology transformation. Rachael has worked with organizations of all sizes across multiple industries in North America to select and implement many kinds of technologies. We at CILTNA really appreciate Rachael's offer to speak to us today on technology, strategy, and adoption. We look forward to her remarks and to her answers to your questions. But first, as with all webinars, a few brief housekeeping reminders. Your audio and video have all been placed on mute. Please leave both muted for the entire session. If you have questions or comments, and we certainly hope that you do, please submit them at any time via the chat feature on Zoom. You can add your questions to the group chat, and I'll do my best to relay them to Rachael at the conclusion of her formal remarks. You can also send questions to members of the Mira team directly as the session progresses if you have a more specific question you'd like answered by them. In the chat index, look for Mira staff Amandine, Julie, or Haley. This webinar is being recorded. In due course, a link to the recording, including Rachael's slides, will be emailed to all participants. It will also be made available on CILTNA's social media feeds. Immediately following the webinar, we will email a brief survey to all participants, and we really appreciate your cooperation to take a few minutes to fill it out, as that will really help us choose topics and refine our delivery for future webinars. Okay, so that's more than enough from me. Rachel, again, thank you, welcome, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Paul, for kicking us off, and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us here today. I think every company has been through a pretty wild ride, and individual for that matter, and definitely wilder than the average. So we've all needed to make some pretty speedy adjustments in lieu of the pandemic that's kind of rocked our world. And today we wanted to talk about, how do we adjust our perceptions for the future and put the tools and systems in place to ensure that we're able to deal with this new challenge that we're facing in this new environment. So disruptions, when we're talking about how they hit, we're not talking not just about how they hit our organization, but also our customers and in the way that they can work with us and the relationships they can have with us as companies. They also hit our staff in a multitude of ways, and also our supply chain partners, all of our vendors, the logistics companies that service us. All of those factors have come into play in the last 6 months, and very urgently. So when we're thinking about kind of the impact that this has had on us, we're thinking not only about how we necessarily get back to where we were. We're looking to do more than that. We're looking to go either beyond it or to maybe even strategically shift the direction our company has to go in light of this new environment that we're working in. So when we're looking at how we assess what those impacts are and then what to do about it, there's a couple of different ways that we can take it. The first thing that we're going to do during today's session is to talk specifically about technology strategy and how we can use those types of considerations in dealing with the impacts that we're seeing, and then also how to actually adopt technology to help us in the way that we transition in this new environment. So here at Mira, Paul had touched on a little bit about what we do. I've been working in Canadian and United States markets, supporting companies that are looking at challenges like this when they're really looking to make a strategic change in their business, whether that's through digital transformation or process optimization, any of those types of facets. We're based here in Vancouver, BC, and we service customers across North America. And Paul had mentioned kind of what we support with. We're seeing a lot of need for that technology adoption piece, particularly in lieu of the pandemic this year. So when we're talking about recovery, we're looking at the shocks that have occurred in light of the pandemic and how we're supposed to react to this new reality that we're facing. It's not going to kind of go back to that normal state that we saw perhaps in November of last year or in perhaps even January of this year. We're really looking at how we're going to take a new strategic direction and build some momentum so that we can get back to what we were trying to achieve in our businesses, or really rethinking what we need to achieve in our businesses in light of new market opportunities that have come to play because of this new reality. So there are lots of places that you can start when you're rethinking that kind of mental model for your business. 3 of the ones that we often see as kind of a starting point for rethinking how to deal with a massive shift like this. One is looking at the customer journey, at what your customers go through from start to finish in their relationship with you as an organization. The other one is an organization's overarching strategy. What are you going to do and not going to do within the marketplace in order to service your customers? And a lot of businesses are seeing a big shift in that sense. Another way that you can kind of start evaluating the impact of something is to start with your digital transformation. And that's what we're going to talk specifically about today. If you think that, for instance, customer journey or strategy are more critical to your business right now, we can definitely talk through that another time, and feel free to reach out to the Mira members that you can find in that direct messaging to say, you know what, I really do need the customer journey side. Can you give me some context about that? But today, again, we're going to focus on digital transformation, or what can also be called IT strategy. So this is kind of a high-level view of what I'm talking about when I say IT strategy. So we've been supporting organizations on technology strategy and realization for the last 10 years. And what we're going to walk through today is the role that technology will play in your organization to help you identify where there's challenges and how to put the structures in place that are necessary in order for your systems to serve you. When we talk about an IT strategy, it falls primarily into 6 pillars. Those are these 6 that you're seeing here: systems, hardware, process, data and reporting, the IT team, and the culture within your organization. So when I'm talking about systems, I'm talking specifically about the tools that you have in play that you can put to use. So that might be your enterprise resource planning system or your warehouse management system, e-commerce platform, any of the platforms and tools that you're going to use that are actually used by your frontline staff, your internal staff, that kind of thing. For hardware, you can think of it as things like your servers. Do you have the horsepower for people to be able to use the systems that you have in place to perform immediate data and reporting? What's the uptime of your systems, basically, and do they have enough server horsepower to support them? This could also be things like your point of sale terminals, pieces like that. So it's the physical hardware. Process, we're talking about all of the activities that need to happen in a certain sequence based on a system or a logic in order for all of these pieces to actually work together. For all of the activities that your business staff need to perform, the way that the systems need to function, all of those pieces from start to finish so that you know at what points data needs to get entered to support reporting later on. Any of those types of pieces, so all the activities that occur in the business. When we're talking about data and reporting, and this is the point at which I think we often find that people kind of forget about this when we're looking at technology selection and adoption. Right at the beginning of when we're looking at systems and the importance of systems, we need to consider the data and reporting expectations that come out of those systems. So when we're talking about that piece, we want to think about what are the flags that we need to see within our business that are going to change the way that we make a decision or the approach we're going to take with a customer or how we're going to deal with a supplier or vendor issue? What are those flags or cues that we need to see that data can provide, and making sure that those actually are baked into the processes so that people put the data and reporting in that's necessary for that, or that the systems actually have fields to capture that data. Data and reporting will touch on these other pillars as well. When we're talking about the IT team, it's really about making sure that we have a team in place that has the skills, both hard and soft skills, to be able to inform the organization and all the users of technology systems, how those systems can be used effectively, when they should be used, who should have access to them, and are able to roll out technologies in a way that people understand the purpose of them and are going to actually use them, so you get some buy-in. And that leads into this cultural piece. So this can kind of get glossed over, and a lot of times on projects we'll talk about change management, but when we're really thinking about culture in terms of IT strategy, this is about how people within your organization think, communicate, and ultimately behave when it comes to technology systems. So we're thinking about the perception that people have around the role technology needs to play in their day-to-day business and their ability to serve customers. So that's really what we're talking about with IT culture. So all of these pillars are necessary for an IT strategy to actually take hold. The 5, hardware, process, data and reporting, IT team, and culture, with those in place, systems are able to function in the way that we need them to. And systems are often a significant investment for a company. So these other pillars need to be in place for systems to really function well. But what we're going to focus on today is that systems pillar, just because we have 45 minutes, so we can't get through everything. But systems pillar is what we're going to focus on, particularly when we're talking about a technology strategy in times like these, when you've got a new technology that you might need to put into place. How do you do that effectively to ensure that it actually meets the ultimate goal of why you purchased that technology? So that's what we're going to dig into today. This technology adoption is something that we've developed over the last 10 years. We've used it across organizations that are small, enterprise, global, municipal in nature, crown corporation, private, you name it. And this technology adoption methodology is something we're going to kind of touch on today. We're going to walk through it at a relatively high level, but I'm going to highlight the areas where things really go wrong. So if, for instance, we think about an ERP implementation, there's a lot of horror stories and a lot of articles about the failure rates for those type of system implementations. And I'm going to talk through a little bit about why those failures occur and how you can catch them if you're going to select and implement a new technology in your organization, particularly if you're going to do it quickly in reaction to something like this pandemic. So when we're looking through these three pieces, oftentimes organizations will jump straight to technology adoption. When we think about tech adoption, it makes sense. You get right into technology deployment, you start pulling the team together, you pick your technology, and you're off to the races. Why I think a lot of technologies fall apart, or at least from my experience, why they do, is because that first step, the business design piece, doesn't happen in a lot of depth. And that's because we're often rushing, because we're reacting to kind of a need. So when we think of that, it's like, okay, pandemic hit, I had to close my brick and mortar store, I'm going to open up an e-commerce solution. You're going to do that step, that phase of business design so quickly because you're responding to something that you don't have control over, and you're going to launch into technology deployment. Where that can fall apart is you've selected maybe the wrong solution, you haven't thought through how operations is going to need to support that system, perhaps you haven't formed a really strong contract or relationship with the vendor who's really going to be a partner through that project. There's a lot of things that kind of get skipped over when we skip business design and launch right into tech deployment. The other piece that things can kind of fall apart on is around that business adoption piece. Once we're live with a beautifully configured technology that we think kind of hits all of our requirements, often we go live with it. And sometimes we can skip over a really important phase, which is business adoption, to make sure that people know how to use it effectively, so training. We've tested the heck out of the system to the point that we know it can carry or cover off our fundamental business processes, the things we cannot screw up with our customers. Those types of pieces are really what's baked into business adoption, and those are pieces that, again, can get glossed over in our hurry to respond to or react to something in the market like the pandemic. So there's lots of things that we've kind of briefly touched on that can go astray. Now we're going to dig into this tech adoption methodology a little bit more, and I'll call out some of the pieces that we've seen be an impact, particularly in the last 6 months. So this first phase is really around business design. And the purpose of this ultimately is to ensure that everyone in the organization is on the exact same page about why we are doing this. And why is not because we need a tracing system for the milk that we're moving between countries. It's about saying, ultimately, we are doing this because we need to increase our quality control. We need to have quality control over that milk that is moving from ocean to ocean. We need to know exactly where things go wrong, and that's going to support us in reducing our insurance costs or knowing where that fault took place in terms of the supply chain itself and the different providers that we've used to shift that product. Or it could be around revenue generation. So we're not just talking about bringing in, say, a B2B e-commerce platform. We're talking about offering a new channel to new customers to generate a new revenue stream. That's the purpose of this. So purpose is really important at this business design phase, to be super clear about what we intend for this to do strategically for our business. And we want to dig deeper than just saying it's to replace our ERP or something like that. We want to talk about strategically, what is this meant to do? The other piece business design is really focused on is making sure we pick the right one. So there's a myriad of solutions that do, tracing of product or inputs. There's tons of them that will do tracking on a product that's been purchased by a customer online and is going to go be received on site. Those types of things. There's so many options out there. And this business design phase is making sure that we know what we actually need from a requirement standpoint, going out to market, having good conversations that get into at least enough level of depth that the vendors, the system providers, understand our needs, at least enough that they can accurately bid on them. And then we want to make sure that we are forming a strong relationship with that technology provider. They are a partner for us when we're going through this process. And when we pick the right one and they know our requirements and they understand the purpose behind this project, they're able to help us deliver it. If they don't know those things, or they're seen as kind of an adversary, or they're trying to gouge us for money, or any of those types of things kind of come into play when we don't form a good relationship with them during this phase, it means that we're not working in the same direction. And that's where often things fall apart from a cost perspective. So when we look at tech adoption, oftentimes, you know, again, the horror stories about change orders and the overarching cost of the program not being nearly what was estimated or budgeted for, those challenges arise because we skip or don't go into enough level of depth in the business design phase. So when we're looking at this piece, it breaks down into about 7 different major activities. The first one is that strategic alignment piece, so making sure we're super clear on what we need this to perform or do for us. So the purpose of this. Success planning, so how are we going to measure that we actually hit that target? So that could be something like, okay, we're going to bring in a new B2B e-commerce solution. We're expecting this to increase our overall revenue by 10% because we're targeting new customers or current customers, and we're offering them something that's in addition to what they already purchased from us. So that might be replacement parts or something like that that we didn't previously offer. That's around that success planning. How are we going to measure the first piece, which is around the purpose and the strategic goal? The current state piece is about actually laying out, if we don't already have it, what are the current state process flows in our operations that we are intending to move into this platform. And the reason we dig into this is it tells us a ton of the requirements, both because we need to maintain current operations, at least to certain ways. And then we also want to say, okay, what are all of the things that are driving us crazy about this current state process, so we can make sure that we're correcting those when we implement this new solution as much as possible. The next 4 activities, we're looking at process redesign. So when we did that current state thought process and said, this is how we do things today, these are the things that drive us nuts about that, how are we actually going to fix them and build out that future state process so that whatever it is that we're bringing forward from a technology perspective aligns with that future state vision and corrects a lot of those challenges. When we're talking about data preparation, this is something that is absolutely necessary on any technology deployment. You need to evaluate the cleanliness of your data and the usability of it, all of those types of things. Data preparation often is kind of left late in the game, I would say, on a project, and it takes a massive amount of effort sometimes, depending on the technology. But if we're thinking about like a product information management system or an ERP implementation or something like that, where we're looking at the fundamental data and data structures of your business, those cleanse activities take a long time to perform, particularly if you're going to move historical data in. So this is something that needs to start really early on in order for it to be done effectively. Technology selection. This part is actually really easy if you do the first 5 steps. So technology selection is about creating, a request for proposal or going out if there's only a couple of unique candidates that can really meet those requirements. You know that there's only a couple. You might reach out to them directly and just say, this is what we're looking for fundamentally. These are the future state processes we expect to live within this system, the type of data structures we're looking for, or at least reporting that we're looking for. This is fundamentally our expectations of what this type of system is going to deliver. Can you tell us how much that's going to cost? Show us some demos of what this looks like. And you really want to dig into what the system is capable of, say out of the box, versus what you're going to have to configure or have developed so that it really lines up with your future state, and if that's even necessary. Sometimes out of the box can be best practice, and that might be a good route to go. Vendor negotiation, oftentimes once technology selection happens, we've seen in the marketplace that people will kind of speed up that vendor negotiation process. And negotiating a contract is very technical in nature from a legal perspective, but there's also certain elements within the contract that you really want to clarify, not so much from a legal perspective, but from a business to business perspective. Things like, how are we going to deal with overages? How do we deal with change orders? Who is the team that's going to actually participate on this project? What are their expertise? And what assurances that they're not going to change on us mid-project, which can really cause a lot of problems on a project. So those types of things are some of the things that we really want to dig into during that vendor negotiation phase. And often these can kind of get skipped over when we think of it only as a legal activity. When we're talking about, so when we got to the end of that first phase, we know that we've got the right system in place, or at least we're pretty sure. Sometimes it can surprise us. We've negotiated a really strong contract and formed a good relationship with the vendor that's providing that solution. We already know what our current state and future state processes are, and we know how those are going to, well, later we'll talk about how those impact training at the end of a project. So we've got those pieces in place. We know the tech, we know what it's meant to do, we know our requirements. This is the point at which we start moving into technology adoption, or deployment, I should say. Technology deployment, there's a couple of places that there's lots of things that can kind of be challenging in this phase, because you're really getting into kind of the meat and potatoes of the project. And one of the pieces that we find is really critical to success from a cost perspective, so that we don't blow the costs on a project, but also for buy-in from people in your organization and from customers if they're expected to kind of touch the system like an e-commerce tool. One of them is around the project management approach and documentation. One of the pieces that falls apart is if, for instance, we haven't been super clear within our organization about what the purpose or ultimate intent of this system is, we can have misaligned expectations. And that means that buy-in falls apart near the end when we're looking for adoption of this new technology, particularly with staff that have been with us for a long time. So we want to make sure that the project management approach that's put in place considers things like change management, the communication that needs to happen, the types of stakeholders that need to be engaged, and at what level of depth, whether or not they should be involved in like a steering committee perhaps, or have any say in decision making that happens on the project. Another piece is we need to ensure that particularly the critical requirements that were established at the first phase of the project are actually what get put in place. So who is going to manage that list of 300 requirements and ensure that the technology is built and delivered in a way that meets those requirements? So that will take some effort. And then during tech deployment, it starts with that project management activity of launch once the contract is signed, and it ends when we're about to hit that kind of go live switch. So we're moving our operations into actually using that technology in our day-to-day. For this phase, there's about 8 major activities that we see take place. That project management piece. One of the pieces I would say we really want to be mindful of is cost and quality management. So for instance, if we're looking at something like a tracing application, and that's the technology that we're putting into place. If we're looking at, the refrigeration that needs to occur from the Canadian marketplace over to the Chinese marketplace, and we need to know every point at which that milk goes from one unit or container to another, from a truck onto a plane, onto another truck that gets delivered to the store that an end user maybe picks it up from. At what point is the temperature of that milk dropping, for instance? That kind of information and that type of data is something that you really need to call out and is potentially a risk or quality risk, I would say, in the deployment of a technology if we're not super clear on how that needs to occur. So when we're looking at project management, we're thinking down to that level around the quality of the end product that is going to be delivered. Is it actually meeting the fundamental needs and requirements that we had set out in phase 1? Those are the types of things that can kind of go awry when you don't have somebody who's dedicated to looking at those really technical requirements and ensuring that they get baked into the quality of the end product. The communication bucket is really about maintaining or building buy-in from the end users within your organization that are going to use this platform. So making sure that they know what's going on with the project, if there's an expectation that isn't going to be reached, or ensuring that it is, those types of things are really important. And it's helpful if we do some reporting or status reports and some communication out to them to know, so that they know it's on track and when it's coming. Vendor design. So when we're looking at this piece, this is when the technology vendor who understands your requirements from that first phase is actually building out how that system is going to be ultimately developed so that it can be used, tested, trained on, all of those good things. This piece, we really want to have subject matter experts on the operational level involved in this piece. So if we think of something like a warehouse management solution, it's one thing for the warehouse manager to be involved as a stakeholder in making sure that the design of the system meets the actual requirements. A lot of things can fall apart if we have only senior level staff that are involved in those conversations with the vendor and providing that kind of information, because they might not know things about, for instance, the scan guns that are used in the warehouse. Currently, if those are still the ones that we're going to use, only the end users who touch those scan guns every single day know the challenges that come into play with those scan guns, what they're capable of, how they can read barcodes, those types of things. So you have to involve those end subject matter experts. You're going to want to have a couple of them on hand that can answer questions in detail to the vendor who's configuring the tech, so that they understand exactly how those challenges or other integrations with hardware or other systems are going to impact the design of their system. So that's why it's so important that we have SMEs or subject matter experts that are really operations level folks who are really involved in the project and speaking directly with the vendor to ensure that they understand the complexities of the day-to-day operations. When we're talking about configuration, so I kind of touched on it with the hardware piece. Another piece that we need to think about is how it impacts the other systems that are in place, especially if there's shared data, and there almost always is. So if we think of something like an ERP solution, that's hosting all of your product data, sales order data, purchase data, all of that good stuff. If we're going to implement an e-commerce solution and we realize that the information that a customer cares about is kind of different from what we care about inside the business. So if we're thinking about an ERP solution from within the walls of our organization, we might want all the technical data and specs on that unit, because we need to know every single dimension that it ships in, the weight of it, all of those different types of pieces, because it impacts the cost we need to charge from a shipping and logistics perspective. To a customer, though, they might not want all the depth of technical information. They probably want the dimensions of the product itself, not just the packaging in which it comes. They also want to know things like really, or it'd be beneficial to them if we had really clear, clean photos of that unit, and maybe internally you never captured those. So now we're talking potentially a product information management solution. Then your ERP integrates with your PIM, integrates with your e-commerce solution, which has to flow back to the ERP. So when we're talking about configuration and the way that all of those different integrations need to come into place, these are the types of complexities that you need to kind of think through and make sure that it's super clear what the expectation is in terms of the source of truth for data. There can only be one source of truth for any individual piece of data, even if it shows up in other systems. Where it gets changed and where the true version of it, or the kind of the source of truth lies, needs to be super clear across all of the different platforms and the vendors that might be involved in a complex implementation. All right, so configuration, one other thing I'll touch on there is it's not always possible, but ideally you want to have a more agile approach to configuration and development of a software solution. The reason for this is if, for instance, I say, okay, we need 8 modules within this system, and they're all going to perform different things. One is going to do sales orders, one's going to do purchase orders, then we're going to do our invoicing. All of these different modules will exist in the system. If we give the requirements to the vendor and then we don't see what they build for 6 months or a year or whatever that timeline is, it's really hard both for the vendor and for the client, to then turn around 6 months later, see the end result and be like, we got it wrong. So what we want to do wherever possible is to have sprint reviews where we're able to see the technology as it's getting designed and built out, so that we can course correct if something is kind of going awry or if there's been a misunderstanding. Next step, data preparation. We talked a bit about what this needs to look like in that first phase. So that might be where you're looking at your data, identifying how much of a depth of cleanse is going to be required. We're looking at the ways that we need to structure the master data and inform the vendor of that before they bid on the work, about how we expect the data structures to kind of flow together, the hierarchy of the data that's needed in our business to support reporting and to support our internal operational activities that need to take place. We also want to look at this stage around the types of reports that are necessary coming out of the system. And when we're thinking about reporting, it's not just to think about, current state. We have 200 different report templates that are produced. We actually don't even remember what they're for, and nobody looks at them, but they come out like clockwork. It's a chance for us, especially with a new system deployment, to rethink reports and data and how we use them. Reporting is really allowing us to make more effective business decisions, strategic or operational. So when we're thinking about reports, it's helpful to start from the point of view of, what are the decisions we fundamentally need to make per department, overarchingly for the company, within our particular business unit, and what data can help us make better, faster decisions. Those are the reports that we need to build out. So this is a really nice time to rethink the mental kind of process that all of your different folks are working through to make better decisions ultimately, and to have them made based on data. This is also really important if, for instance, you're looking to sell a portion of your business or are looking to purchase a business, is to dig into the types of reports that can be produced out of their systems. It tells you whether or not they're able to make good decisions, or that you, if you're selling your business, are trying to prove out the value of your business and how good you are at making business decisions based on actual data. Once the system has been configured and it's been shown to people a couple of times as it gets iteratively built out, the reports are built out, the data, the master data at a minimum, has been shifted into that new system. This is the point at which testing comes into place. When we're looking at technology adoption, oftentimes, even if this first part was done beautifully and everybody's super happy and on the same page, or at least they think they are, testing is the point, especially user acceptance testing, is the point at which we really test whether the system meets the fundamental needs of the business or if we've missed something. User acceptance testing is performed by end users. So when we're talking about the subject matter experts at the operational level that we wanted to have engaged throughout this phase of the project, these are the folks that should be testing the system that's been built out. And this testing needs to occur after the technology vendor has done their systems and integration and operational testing of what they have built. So it comes over as bug-free as possible, as defect-free as possible, so that users are able to, not get hung up on the defects that can occur in a system, but are able to actually test real scenarios that occur in their business. So if we're thinking of something like, a product information management solution, and we want to go test what's been built out by the vendor, that PIM. If we're looking at, putting in a flow through, okay, we've got a new product we want to add in. What do we need to do in the ERP? What information then flows into the PIM? And then how do we build out additional information in the PIM, like all of the photos that our customers want and the product dimensions that they want, and those types of details. If, as a user, I'm going through that user acceptance test and I keep getting these error messages, that's when UAT can kind of get really hung up, and we need the vendors to perform their due diligence on the testing before they get to that point to avoid that. But UAT is not just a chance to kind of go through your high-level, most common scenarios. It's to go through the scenarios that are really strategic to your customer. So what is it that we're testing, not just to ensure that the PIM holds the information that we need from our perspective inside the business, but how are we making sure that it's actually flowing through from the customer journey perspective, so that when a customer using our e-commerce platform is actually going to purchase an item, making sure that their experience matches the expectations of what the PIM was meant to provide to them as the customer. So that's a helpful lens to use when you're going through UAT, is not just to test it from your internal operations, but to test it also from the perspective of how it would impact the customer's experience or the supply chain provider's experience. Training, when we're talking about technology deployment and training, oftentimes it's easy to kind of think about training for the internal staff that are going to be touching the system. But if we're implementing something like, say, a source-to-pay platform, we need to think about our customers for sure, but also our supply chain partners. So for training, when we're looking at source-to-pay solutions, so we're going to bring in a Coupa or an SAP Ariba or whatever it is that helps us make better procurement decisions, we also need to think about training from the perspective of our supply chain providers, because they're going to ultimately also have to be involved in how that system is used, use that system themselves on a daily basis. So when we're thinking about training, we want to think about all of the different people who are going to have to get trained on this system and how we can effectively deliver that in a way that they can use it, re-review it, go back to that training if they need to. If we're onboarding a new supply chain provider onto our source-to-pay solution, how are they going to get trained 2 years down the road? There's a lot of different factors to think about with training, and often we can just say, okay, it's going to take us 30 days to train our 1,000 staff on how to use this system, and like, look at us, we did it. And then you remember, wait a second, the customers are actually going to have to touch this too. How are we going to arm them to use this and get them to buy into this system? Training is an important part of that. When we get to the last part is the go live. So this part, there's a lot of transition to operations activities that need to be considered before we flip that switch. So it's things about risk mitigation. What if this system, when we flip it, doesn't function either because our servers can't handle it or because, you know, there was a glitch in the system we just didn't account for, there was an integration that we didn't quite nail. What are we going to do about it? How are we going to know that that risk occurred? How are we going to backtrack ourselves out of it a little bit? What are the things that we need to put in place so that if this goes awry, we're not going to impact our customers, our staff, and our supply chain partners, at least as best we can. This last phase, the business adoption, is okay, we've gone live with the system. How do we ensure that this system continues to be used in the manner in which we are expecting it to, so that it actually delivers value? So this part is about saying, you know, it's one thing to go live with a new technology. It's another to continue to use it effectively to the greatest value that we can actually get out of it. And what does that need to look like? Who needs to be involved moving forward operationally to ensure that the system continues to deliver what our expectations are of it, or beyond that, especially as systems release new technologies or modules that couple onto that system that we should be using. So this one here goes through 4 major activities, essentially. The business rollout piece, I think one of the big things that we forget about with Go Live is to celebrate it. Usually it was a big investment of time, people, energy, budget, and we want to make sure that we're celebrating what we've been able to kind of successfully do. The other piece is around measuring and reinforcing. So we want to make sure not only did we go live with a system, and our expectation was, say, that 20% of our current customers are now going to use our brand new e-commerce platform. How are we measuring that that uptake has actually occurred? And not just at the beginning, but as time goes on. And how do those expectations need to shift over time? Are we expecting 20% of our customers to use it in the first 6 months, and that's all we care about is maintaining that 20%? Or are we looking to get 50% of our customers to be using that, that platform moving forward within the next 3 years. How are we going to accomplish that? How are we going to measure it? How are we going to make it happen? Transfer to operations. This is the piece where oftentimes we can kind of forget about this when we're in the first phase of kind of planning for a major adoption. If you're going to bring in a new technology, it's not just the project itself that we need to think through. It's also at the point that the project is over, who is going to be involved in taking in inquiries from people that come in, whether they're customer or internal folks? Who's going to make sure that we're, performing that measuring piece and reinforcement piece on the adoption that needs to happen internally? How are we looking at defects that come up? And they will. New releases that happen, they do, or enhancements that we want to bring into the system when our operations shift again, say 2 or 3 years down the road even. The other piece is around continuous improvements, and this gets discussed a lot. In that first phase, we'd created the current state process flows, the future state process flows that we based our requirements on. This closing the process gaps piece, it's not like you create those future state process flows and then you should never touch them again. It's something that we want to make sure is kind of baked into our operations, that those future state processes need to be reviewed. They need to be talked about with subject matter experts right on the operations floor so that they're evaluating those process flows that have now become the new current state and are calling out challenges so we can address them either in the process itself or directly in the system. There might be an adjustment that needs to be made a year down the road that would really allow people to reduce their manual entry, for instance, into the system, free up their time to do more value-added activities. We always want to be evaluating those types of pieces that are at our disposal, and what better place to start than with the people that actually perform that function. They know what the challenges are and they are happy to tell you usually. So that's what closing the process gaps is really all about. With that, closing the process gaps is really where this entire methodology kind of wraps up all together, and you're going through that cycle over and over again. What needs to be improved? How do we make sure that we're hitting the purpose of that improvement? How do we drive success with that improvement, whether it's technology or otherwise? And then how are we going through that mental cycle throughout our business? All of the time, it's kind of built into the psyche to make sure that we're always getting the most out of our technologies, our processes, and our people to make us a successful organization. So I know we've blown through technology strategy and technology adoption in about 40 minutes. There's lots of help that's available here. If there's anything that you need, we have a lot of tools on our website, and you'll get this deck so you'll be able to click on the links directly from it. But you can see things like how to develop your own IT strategy with a bit more detail and some of the actual tools that we use here at Mira. How to pick a technology. So we talked a little bit about that in that first phase, but we also have a technology adoption tool that's on our website you're welcome to download and use. And then we've also recognized that a lot of organizations are really struggling on how to shift their business model or how to deal with some of the crises that they're facing during the pandemic. And we're offering free help sessions. If you need to have just a second brain to say, this is what I'm facing, give me at least a couple ideas on a step one, feel free to book a time if you want to talk to us directly and just get a second brain, basically. And with that, I can hand it back over to you, Paul.
Rachel, that's just terrific. So thank you very much for this, as you say, whirlwind tour. I would add whirlwind tour de force on technology, strategy, and adoption. It's a great primer, I think, for our audience, a great checklist on focus areas and potential pitfalls when considering additions or enhancements to your supply chain platforms. And in particular, a special thank you to you and your team at Mira for your generous offer of assistance in the future. We've got a number of questions and comments in the Zoom queue already, and I encourage everyone to submit additional queries as they occur to them. But just before we turn to the Q&A, I'd like to mention an upcoming webinar, which we think is an ideal follow-up to the education that Rachel just gave us. As you can see on the screen, it will address technology implementation at the Port of Antwerp. So mark your calendars for Thursday of next week, and we'll make sure you have the registration link. And we certainly hope you can join us. So on to the questions. And as I say, we've got a number. Let me just dial back. First one from CILTNA's own Marion Robson right there in Vancouver, who asked, the business design phase seems critical to the success of the project. And Rachel, I think you talked about how if you're going to have a problem with budget, or if you're going to have a problem with schedule, or indeed if you're going to have a problem with scope creep, which we've all experienced, it can often be traced back to this business design phase. Marion points out that during the pandemic, companies are trying to adapt their operations and technology very quickly. How long does this business design phase typically take?
So it really depends on what you already have in place in your business. So if you already have your current state processes documented, you're off to a really good start. I often include process flows directly in the RFP. It gives vendors a very clear understanding of the expectations, activities, types of roles involved, types of data even sometimes that you're capturing. If you have internal documentation around the processes, standard operating procedures, that kind of stuff that you already have, that will be a really strong indication of the requirements that you need to put together to speed up that phase. I would say if an organization does not have those pieces documented, it is a great improvement opportunity just generally for your operations to go through that activity, and I'd strongly advise it, but oftentimes you might need to bring in additional support to speed up that process. So with some of our organizations that got really hit by the pandemic, who had a brick and mortar store, they had to get onto e-commerce super quickly. You can bring in additional hands on deck, advisors, consultants, whatever it is you need, or additional part-time staff member to get all of that collateral together so that you get the right requirements, and you could do that in a flurry in a month if you had to, but you will expect to kind of probably have to budget 20% more than whatever the proposal is that comes in for anything that you missed. If you're going to do kind of a rush job, we see usually that there's going to be an overage of about 20-25% if we rush that first phase. Whereas if we nail it down, we see closer to maybe a 10% or no overage for a project. So it depends how long that phase takes based on what you already have in place in terms of current documentation.
Okay, great. Staying in Vancouver, BCIT's very own Professor Jackie Lee asks, for a small business that does not currently use any sophisticated software packages and does not have a big budget for an elaborate system, what would you suggest for them to take the easy first step to start on the tech transformation journey?
I would probably start with looking at your customer journey process and your supply chain partner processes and saying, okay, what are the things that our customers need? So if, for instance, we're looking at BCIT, the customer being the student, what is it that the students need in terms of information, access, those types of things that are really fundamental to the getting them the greatest value, and then looking at what tech already do we have access to, as rudimentary as it might look, how can we get creative about using it? So digging into like, what are the new releases that already came out with some of the kind of free or cheaper solutions we already use? Is there, something new that they're offering within the technology? Especially with the pandemic, a lot of systems are releasing new modules that can kind of support us, and making the most use of what you already have. Often with tech strategy, it's not about necessarily bringing in net new technology. It's about getting the most out of what you already have.
Okay, great. Thank you. Emile DeSanza, our chair of CILTNA, asks, how can companies avoid the risks and costs associated with technological obsolescence? So, continuing on your theme of going all the way around the life cycle. Do companies typically concern themselves with this when they're sort of embarking on this journey?
I would say it's often not in the back of our minds when we're looking at a new technology. Oftentimes we kind of forget about what that end of life needs to look like. I think the biggest thing that an organization can do to recognize when a technology is kind of reaching that point of obsolescence or has even gone beyond it is to assign a system owner. typically most organizations don't actually go through this activity. And that's what we see when we do a technology scan or an IT strategy project. A company often will have kind of 40 systems or 100 systems that they use. They don't even realize it, and they don't know who uses which ones are paid, which department is paying for them, when those contracts end, when kind of our licenses are going to expire and our agreements are going to end. None of that gets documented down. And in order for us to recognize when a technology is going to become obsolete, you need to have someone who is accountable for owning that system and understanding the purpose it serves within the organization, and when that purpose no longer actually exists or needs to be served, or when that technology is no longer serving that purpose. If you don't have one name in the accountable seat who's meant to answer those questions and speak to those on at least an annual basis around each technology, that's the point at which we start overpaying or even having duplicate systems within an environment that we're paying for everybody to have a license for. Thinks Teams and Zoom and Uber conference lines and all that kind of stuff. We're paying for multiple licenses there when they all actually serve the same purpose. We just didn't realize everyone across our organization had access to all three. That's an example of where those redundancies can kind of take place. If you have a system owner, you can avoid that.
System ownership. Okay, very, very important point. I apologize in advance for mispronouncing the name of our next questioner. Abhijit Badra asks, can you please highlight any recent examples of technology disruption happening in the transportation or international trade spaces, especially during this pandemic?
I missed the middle part of that question. Sorry, Paul.
No, not at all. And this is, I think, a bit beyond, it's a very interesting question. I think perhaps a bit beyond the scope of what we're talking about today, but we'll give it a try. Can you please highlight any recent examples of technology disruption happening in the transportation industry or in international trade, especially during this pandemic?
Yeah, I mean, I would definitely say that there's a lot of not necessarily net new technologies that are coming into play that we never saw before, but their application being very different. Absolutely, there's disruption. So when we're looking at the way that face-to-face sports were delivered, for instance, to children's hockey, we can look at the way that children were able to go to a facility on the ice and have, you know, their 10-on-10 player games, whatever that looked like. And you had all of the parents and grandparents in the stadium that were able to actually view what was happening. It's not that video technology didn't exist before the pandemic. It's just getting applied in a very different way so that parents and grandparents who are physically not able to be in the stadium anymore because of COVID and the amount of people that can be in closer proximity, but they still want to see what their kids are doing on the ice. They've paid for this program and they want to see the development in their children. You can use video, you can use tracing technologies, you can use those types of pieces and apply them to that industry to still allow the customer experience to take place, and you're reutilizing a technology that's existed for a really long time just in a new way, so that you're supplementing the customer journey, even though the pandemic has really changed the way that maybe that customer journey used to be able to play out. So we're definitely seeing disruption in terms of the way that technologies are getting applied. And we're seeing a lot of disruption in terms of the volume of organizations that are taking advantage of technologies that already existed. There's going to be a lot of new technology that's getting developed. Some have already been deployed when it comes to things like temperature scans when you're entering into the building, and being able to create those technologies net new in the last 6 months and deploy them directly into centers that see high volumes of people coming through the door. Those are some of the net new technologies that existed to an extent in the past, but they're really getting worked on and developed so that we can continue kind of working and going into work or going into service centers and things like that from a community perspective.
Well, great response. Probably have time for one more here. So, and it a little bit has been segued into by the previous question and your answer. David Carden asks, logistics companies are going to be connecting to other platforms and he gives a strong example of port optimization systems.
Mhm.
What sort of considerations do you have to keep in mind when you're considering, creating these new connections that weren't there before? David mentions API. I hope you know what API is, because I certainly don't, but he
Yeah.
mentions that API is a big part of that. But what other
Yes.
things do we have to think about?
Definitely that integration piece. And the way that, when we're talking about API, we're talking about the way that different platforms or different technologies have been built using different code or language, essentially. And API allows us to integrate those two systems that maybe speak a different language so that they still are able to communicate with each other. So think of them almost like a translator. In a very simplified way. So when we're talking about integrations, we do want to make sure that the way that systems speak to each other are actually capable of doing so. We also need to think through things like that source of truth piece for data. When we have different systems that take in information, we need to think about what the source of truth is and how we're going to balance when there's a discrepancy between the two. So for instance, if you have an internal system like a CRM where you're capturing customer data, but then you also have that tied with an online customer account, and the customer goes in and changes their address on that account. Which one is the source of truth? So those types of pieces around data management really come into play when we start talking about integrations between systems. We also need to think about things like conversion of data. So for instance, at a port, you might have dimensions coming in from a package from the States, and they're usually using a different type of metric or measuring standard, whereas at the port, if it's in Canada, might be using a different standard. How are we going to marry those two together accurately? I think one of the big ones that comes to mind for me is around currency and exchange rates, and how those need to be considered, especially when we're looking at ports that are coming internationally. There's so many different currencies that need to be accounted for in all of those different systems. And when you're integrating something that's like a tracing tool or a tracking tool, that's tracking something that's coming from China, it's going to another port along the way and stopping, picking up some more materials that are in a different currency in terms of the valuation that's been applied for insurance purposes. Then it comes to us and we're converting it again. What are the exchange rates? Where are we getting them from? Are they timely in nature, so that the end result is that we're actually calculating, say, the loss and therefore insurance claim on that piece accurately? Those are all the types of things that immediately come to mind, but I could probably go on for a while on that one.
Well, that's great. That's great, Rachel. Thank you. So, folks, we're slipping past the top of the hour here, so I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it at that. You'll have the Mira team's contact and help available information in the presentation package that we'll send out to you shortly. And you'll also have, and you can see it right here, CILTNA's website information. And again, we encourage all transportation and logistics professionals to have a look at the benefits and, I might add, the very low cost of membership in our institute. Once again, we'll ask you to take just a few minutes to complete the survey, which we'll send out to you right away. In fact, I think you see it there now on the chat. That will help us tremendously if you would kindly do that. So Rachel, in closing, on behalf of all attendees and all CILTNA members, thanks to you and to the Mira team for this terrific presentation. I hope you enjoyed delivering it as much as I enjoyed learning from it while you did so. Thanks again to all of our attendees, and this ends today's webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.